Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Adya, and I'll be speaking to my colleague Anushka Saxena about the Black Sea deal, which is a recent agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Anushka, thank you so much for being here and shedding light on something that's so central to international affairs right now. And I can't wait to get into it.
Thanks so much for having me, Adya.
Great, thank you. Should we jump right in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so just to start off, I know there's been a lot of news about the agreement concerning the Black Sea involving Russia, Ukraine, and the US. Could you just start by explaining the main points of this new deal and what exactly its focal points are?
Happy to. Yeah. So, just for a little bit of context, I'm sure our listeners are very well aware that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has stretched into many, many years now. And initially, it was supposed to be just maybe some 10 to 100 days of war. But now it's been, 3 years, and there's not a lot of confidence that it's going to end anytime soon. And so I think this Black Sea deal or understanding, which would perhaps be a better term for it, was something that was concluded during the negotiations between representatives from the US, Russia, and Ukraine in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, towards the end of last month, which was March. So between March 23 and 25, delegations from what we know as the expert groups on the Black Sea from the US and Russia met in Saudi Arabia. And they talked about whether there can be the beginning to the end of this war, and should it start with the main naval theater of the war, which is the Black Sea, right? And it's obviously a really strategic but contentious region. A lot of the maritime trade in the Eurasian region passes from there. For Ukraine, I think at the height of its trading numbers, it's some 90% of its trade went through the Black Sea. I'm sure the numbers are very high for Russia as well, although the accounts on that are disputed, but it's somewhere between 60 to 80%. And I think since 2022, what has happened is that naval power projection in the Russia-Ukraine conflict has become key and central to the war as a whole. And so Black Sea has naturally and not surprisingly emerged as the region where there is intense naval deployment, both from Russia's famous, or should I say infamous, Black Sea Fleet, Ukraine's warships, and Russian submarines as well, of course. And so, of course, Russia also had control over Crimea for a decade. So it also was able to mobilize a lot of naval arsenal from there, and a lot of important ports like the Sevastopol Bay in Crimea became sites of conflict because Ukraine wanted to take control of those, and Russia continued to retain control. Same way on the Ukrainian territory, Russia tried to take control of important Black Sea ports like Odessa and Mariupol, and it has succeeded in some of it, but I think we can get to that later. So coming quickly to the question that you've posed, which is on the key points of the deal, what was discussed at Riyadh was the US and Russia agreeing to ensure safe navigation, eliminating the use of force, and preventing the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. And I think the main goal behind all of this is to bring cessation of hostilities in at least the main naval theater, even if the invasion as a whole doesn't conclude. And in exchange, the US promised to help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports. It also promised that it will lower maritime insurance costs for Russian vessels and other vessels that use Russian ports, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. So now the thing is, because of the war and because of hostilities in the Black Sea region, which is a crucial trade passageway, the maritime insurance costs for a lot of commercial shipping vessels had gotten really high, and that was because countries like the US and countries in Europe refused to insure these ships against any kind of breakages or damages sustained because of war. So maritime insurance costs were really high. Plus, the US had also threatened to not renew maritime insurances of some of the commercial vessels, especially from Russia. And this is, a trade restricting kind of a strategy. So there are some provisions on that front in the deal or the understanding as well. And finally, the two sides also deliberated putting an end to strikes against energy facilities in both Russia and Ukraine. Now, interestingly, if you look at the White House statement on this agreement, it's said to be only between the US and Russia, and Ukraine isn't involved here, even though we know that Ukrainian parties and representatives were present in Saudi Arabia at this time when the negotiations were taking place. Nonetheless, I think the US has first tried to rope in Russia to ban said strikes. There have been a lot of drone and missile strikes on energy facilities, including renewable energy facilities, but also nuclear, oil, and gas facilities. And those can be critical infrastructure for all countries, right? Let alone Russia and Ukraine. So there's an attempt to kind of put an end to that. And finally, I think the broader context behind this agreement is that Donald Trump, since the beginning of his second term, has made two broad points. One is that, if he was in office as president of the United States, the invasion would have never happened. And the second is that now he's going to be the one that brings an end to it in his tenure. So, because he has self styled and self proclaimed himself as the bringer of peace to the Russia Ukraine conflict, it's likely that we're going to see these continued efforts towards deal making and agreement signing with Russia and Ukraine. And just one quick point is about what Ukraine will potentially get in return for agreeing to something like this. And this is mostly reported, right? We don't have an official statement of what Ukraine is likely to get in return. But there has been a lot of discussion surrounding the US facilitating a return of forcibly taken Ukrainian children to Russia. So he's going to arrange for a return of Ukrainian children's populations from Russia to back to Ukraine, and also try to get into a prisoner swap to see if both sides can have their people back. So this is what the US has potentially promised Ukraine for agreeing to something like this. Now, will this agreement work and what its loopholes are is something maybe we can take head on in this conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I have to ask, apart from President Trump's obvious self-serving idea that he wants to leave a mark and therefore he wants to be the one to broker peace, what is it that makes this current arrangement potentially different? I mean, I know that there have been previous attempts to broker deals in that region. So and they faced significant challenges, right? So what sets this apart? What are the factors that might determine the success of this deal in time?
Right. I think it would be a bit of an exaggeration to say that this deal is different and it really is something new and innovative, something we've never seen before. For starters, we know that in 2022-23, there was the brokering of something known as a Black Sea Grain Initiative. And the goal of that initiative was something similar to the arrangement that we've seen with this deal, right? Because both Ukraine and Russia have been major exporters of grain, fertilizers, and other agro products. With the war and the weaponization of the naval theater, that is the Black Sea, a lot of these exports were halted, and the maritime routes that took along some of these important consumer products really came to a dead stop, right? And so in 2022, there was an attempt by the UN and some other parties like Turkey and of course Russia and Ukraine involved to kind of slowly bring respite to the Black Sea conflict and resume the exports of agro products. And this is also a time when food prices and fertilizer prices have really gone up, right? And they've really hiked. So I think that was a similar initiative that aimed for the cessation of hostilities for the purpose of bringing some semblance of stability to the global food market. But eventually, what happened was 1 year after the deal was kind of supposed to be renewed, it had a 1 year mandate. And when it was supposed to be renewed, Russia said something to the tune of, oh, it's the sanctions that are really causing the rises in grain prices or fuel prices or fertilizer prices. And a cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea or a resumption of maritime trade as usual is not going to lead to anything. And so around, I think, July 2023, when the deal came up for an extension, Russia eventually backed out. And so, in that sense, if anything, you can see a lot of similarities between what happened then and what is happening today, right? Because the reason why I insisted on calling the recent agreement an understanding more than a deal is because this time Russia has learned its lesson, and it's very clearly said that until and unless some of the sanctions from its fertilizer or agro or fuel exports are lifted, and if until at least one Russian bank is connected with the SWIFT payment system, which most Russian banks were frozen out of, it's not going to sign a document and turn it into an agreement, right? And it's not going to negotiate with Ukraine. So the cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea and all the other promises that the US tried to make to Russia to assure it in exchange for the cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea or the ban on strikes against energy facilities. All of this is in a limbo because Russia wants its requirements or its demands to be fulfilled before it can sign on the piece of paper. And so during the Black Sea Grain Initiative phase, it had already agreed to something, but it felt like its purposes weren't being met, especially also because the US wasn't a very big player in the Black Sea Grain Initiative negotiations. And so also because, Biden had a policy that he's not going to negotiate on gunpoint. So now I guess Russia is repeating some of that rhetoric, and the hope is that exports will continue. There will be food security in the world again, but it was only going to be a matter of time that sanctions came up on the table, and Russia received some sanctions related or finance payments related concessions. If we were going to talk peace, so peace negotiations go two ways, and it was only, like I said, a matter of time before something like this came up. So in that sense, there have been a lot of similarities from different negotiation processes in the past. In the past as well, Ukraine has demanded prisoner swaps, return of forcibly taken children. Still, of course, it hasn't really happened in a big way. And so, in that sense, Ukraine's demands are also pretty similar. But again, whether Trump will be the factor that really makes all of this happens, again, is something that's too early to make a comment on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Especially Russia's reluctance to formalize this as a deal got me thinking. Like, focusing on the sea is one thing, but how do you see this maritime ceasefire sorts connect with the fighting on land in Ukraine? Like, do you think this can potentially influence the broad military situation, or are there things left to be desired for this to materialize?
So I think, Adya, the question that many negotiators and countries in the world are really dealing with is that, what is the solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? How can it end? Will Russia win the war? Will Ukraine finally receive enough aid to be able to overpower Russian defenses? Or if it will end like North Korea and South Korea in 53, right? And it's going to be frozen and Russia will retain control of everything it's taken over, but Ukraine will receive some concessions and would retain control over the rest of the territory of the country as is. And so I think this is the $1 million question with a lot of this. But one thing that, and it's not an easy one to answer, but one thing that I can positively say is that the Black Sea deal, if materialized, may have little effect on the ongoing fighting over land, but where it can really play a role is in fast tracking peace negotiations. So, even till today, we hear news surrounding how Russia has developed an anti drone naval system where if Ukraine fires a drone over Crimea or any bit of the Russian territory via the Black Sea, this anti-drone system can counter it, which means that strikes are going on using the naval theater, right? Similarly, we see that Russia has continued to strike Ukrainian energy facilities, and it's recently kind of raised a parliamentary proposal to hire some more 160,000 men to fight in the Russia-Ukraine war, right? And all of these are land-related, especially this conscription is a land-related measure, but also naval hostilities have continued and the fighting on land has only seen more rigor. And some estimates from early 2025 are telling us that Ukraine is still continuing to produce many first person view or FPV drones, and Russia apparently produces some 4,000 a day. So all of this is still going on, and these have been important tools for war fighting on land. Russia and Putin have consistently, even till today, been asking for the liberation, so-called liberation of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent territories. And Putin, even after the deal, made a claim, and this was something that surprisingly was also supported by Trump's kind of advisor in the Riyadh negotiations, Sam Witkoff, that the referenda conducted in Donetsk and Luhansk clearly point out that these territories want to join Russia, and the people want to join Russia, and they don't want to be a part of Ukraine. So, interestingly, both the narrative and the operational bits of land warfare are continuing with gusto. And only if the Black Sea deal materializes and we finally do see a cessation of hostilities from the naval theater. A lot of Russian S-400s are used to launch surface to airs from the Black Sea to not just port cities, but also to cities well inside of Ukraine because of their 400, 500-kilometer range. So truly, if we see some cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea, we might be able to construe it as a sign of more peace to come, but we certainly cannot take it as a guarantee that the land warfare will end or end in a frozen conflict or with Russia's victory or defeat.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And honestly, I think I understand better now why the Black Sea has been such a major flashpoint in this conflict. I was wondering, what would you say the biggest hurdles or weak spots are in making this agreement actually work on the ground? How fragile would you say it is? Because, especially if Russia has already expressed their hesitations and their discontent in actually seeing some of these things materialize, it seems to me as if, we can't count our chickens before they've hatched. We can't talk about how this agreement is, the end of the war or the beginning of the peace in the region without actually having any outcome. So, what would you say the biggest hurdles are right now?
Right. I think as you know, we already discussed. I think the big one that is in our faces is Russia's lack of willingness to come to the table, agree to it before um, its demands are met. So it wants the sanctions to be uplifted, and it wants Russian banks to be connected to the SWIFT international payment system, and then only then it's going to see the terms of the agreement through. And of course, the big factor here, in addition to Russia's very conditional agreement, is Europe. And if Russia is demanding that the West lift the sanctions on global agricultural and fertilizer exports for Russia, the US can promise whatever it wants, right? And Trump has, as part of the deal, if you see, Trump does promise reinstated access for Russia in the global markets. But is it going to be that easy to convince a Europe that you see slightly drifting away from US influence and trying to create an image for itself and taking a stance on some of these issues? I mean, this is a Europe that when JD Vance came and talked to at I think Davos or the Munich Security Conference, one of those, if I'm not wrong. He's telling them that, look, you have no right to look elsewhere. You have no right to point fingers at America. Look internally, and you will see that you are a backsliding democracy, and your immigrant rights are a sham, right? And you have this strict immigration policy that's really making lives harder. And all of this may or may not have a grain of truth. That's a separate conversation for experts on internal European dynamics. But it is still creating rifts between the US and Europe, right? And this, by the way, is likely to be a mega trend we're going to continue to observe in the years to come, is that as US tries to shape its own identity, it's going to have political conversations that it should have had when the European Union was in the making, and it's going to try and create its own image as separate from the US. And so, in this regard, I think if it has to retain its image as a beacon of democracy, if it has to continue to support Ukraine, which is a Eurasian economy, as you will, as you will understand it, Europe is likely to take a tough stance against the removal of sanctions from Russia and it's an inclusion of Russian banks in the SWIFT payment system. Now, will that lead the US to react poorly to Europe and use economic tools of, high statecraft, as it were? Maybe. And the reactions are likely to be poor from the Trump administration. But in a moment of transatlantic unity, this will be kind of a black spot in the US's history, but I don't know if Trump's very concerned with that. So in addition to the main challenge that is Russia wanting its demands fulfilled before it can sign the piece of paper, Europe's not being on board vis-a-vis the removal of sanctions may be another important factor that really makes or breaks the so-called agreement. And it also points to the fact that no negotiation on the peace deal between Russia and Ukraine can go about without the inclusion of Europe, right? And finally, I think one factor on the ground is also basic economics. If you look at Ukraine's agricultural exporters, grain exporters in specific, in the past couple years, they've tried to find alternative routes to kind of meeting the export requirement and circumventing the disruption of maritime trade in the Black Sea. And some of these routes have gone through ports like Romania's Constanta port, or Turkey has been of some support, so on and so forth, right? So, how will the economics of the reshifting of supply chains work out, and will grain exporters and agriculturalists have the same confidence resuming trade in the Black Sea and bringing markets back to a new normal? How will that work out? Will cargo insurance really go down? Will maritime and commercial shipping firms regain some of the confidence and leverage they had before the war? Can they seek protection from war related damages? All of these are big questions from an economic and entrepreneurial point of view that not just the Russian and Ukrainian governments will have to try and address, but the world, and especially the sanctioners, which are the US and the EU, will also have to decide on some respite for.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for shedding light on the deal and what its limitations and trade offs are. Finally, before we wrap up, I had one question that I wanted to ask you. Beyond the immediate terms of this particular deal, what broader steps or diplomatic efforts do you think would be needed to build momentum towards a much more sustainable and peaceful resolution in the region? Because I think clearly, as we see from this deal, there's a lot still left to be desired, and both sides seem to have many, many demands that are left unfulfilled, which I think need to be addressed for the fighting to cease on the ground.
Yeah, I think, again, like I said, this is $1 million question on how to bring peace to the region. And I think one kind of strain of thought on how to go about this, that I would most likely advocate for as not being the main authority working on these issues, is sort of a negotiated settlement or a permanent ceasefire that freezes conflict exactly where it is, because it's unlikely that Russia is going to agree to cessation of hostilities without gaining any leverage in the form of territory. Of course, there will have to be a conversation on the removal of sanctions. As I said, it was only a matter of time before Russia was promised some relief on sanctions for peace to happen. And so it's finally on the table now. So I'm sure the US will have to offer some concessions. And Ukraine, on the other hand, will need to see great support with democratic rebuilding, infrastructure related support for internal economic stability. Grain exporters will need freer trade route options from the Black Sea, so on and so forth. And of course, because Trump has now declared that it's going to be in a deal with Ukraine over its critical minerals facilities, there will be some presence of some 200 or 300 US civilians in Ukraine as well. And so, could that translate into the US providing Ukraine with monetary or defense-related support? Maybe, and that could go a long way in acting as a deterrent and securing Ukrainian borders overall. But I think the main victor from a frozen conflict would be Russia, especially if it gets to retain both the port and the solely continental territories that it has made a headway in the conflict. So I think that negotiated settlement, which involves some concessions to both Russia and Ukraine, and not even concessions for Ukraine, but a lot of investment in its rebuilding and ensuring confidence in and deterrence for the Ukrainian people. I think that is the broad, vague way to go. Of course, one point of note is that it's unlikely that a negotiated settlement is possible with just the US and Russia on the table. And so, if Trump is indeed going to be the main peace broker for the conflict, he has to take into account that both Europe and China have to be on the table, and China is doing better diplomatically to kind of show support to the EU vis-a-vis its participation in the settlement of the Russia-Ukraine conflict than the US is. And so I think this has to be, like I said previously as well, a moment of transatlantic unity, even if, once the conflict freezes or the ceasefire happens, the two sides, US and the EU, depart for a little bit as they shape their own identities. But for now, if there has to be a negotiation towards peace, it has to be Russia, Ukraine, US, Europe, and China, in addition to the good offices of certain other countries that wish to mediate and can be successful in doing so.
Thank you so much. I know my last question, of course, was broad and open-ended and not the kind of question that could be answered this easily, because, of course, if it could be, we would already have peace in the region. But thank you so much for your time. And I think this is also going to give our listeners a lot of food for thought, because this is an issue that the world has been grappling with for many, many months now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adya. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.